Greetings, everybody. It's Friday afternoon, and this is the teaching video for this coming Sunday, December the 6th. It will be a all-together in-person community gathering. We'll be meeting in the auditorium at 10 a.m. all together. And for those of you who are normally on Zoom at noon, I'll be getting things put together so that you'll be able to participate with us at that time. So in person and Zoom, all in one meeting at 10 a.m. This coming Sunday, gathering there in the auditorium, and we'll spend that time together just to be reminded, as we do at the first of each month, about the larger families that we're a part of, even though the other weeks, for a number of reasons, not just practical ones and health ones, we're meeting together in the simple churches. And I gave you got you all on email lists to inform you about who's in those simple churches with you. And I ask that you keep those lists available, print it out, be praying for those people, reach out to one another, ministering to one another, not just a few of us or one of us doing all the work of ministering, but all of us ministering together is what we need all the time, but especially at this time with all the isolation and changing situations. So please follow through on that, I'd ask, and reach out to someone who's in your simple church there, and whether it's on the Zoom simple church right now or the in-person churches that are meeting together. But we will be getting together, so I'll have other announcements, and we'll have a time of singing together and remembering the season this coming week. So let me just jump right into the teaching and get your hearts and minds oriented to what we're going to be sharing in this coming Sunday. We're looking at 1 Peter 2, verses 18 to 25. And before I do that, let me share my screen in such a way that you can see me here, and go about it that way. Great. I think that will work that way. So again, we're continuing on in our study in 1 Peter, and we're moving into the household text we talked about last week, where Peter gives instructions based on what God has done for us, gives instructions about what an honorable life looks like, the life that pleases God looks like in various aspects of life, particularly for the people at that time, writing to them in their situation, Lord, but also for things that have significance for us today. And that's what we're trying to draw out of this. I've entitled this one, Winning Everything by Losing Some Things. And this is growing specifically out of Peter's admonition to those who found themselves in the position of being slaves. Very difficult, but a very common social position for many people in the Roman world, but in the churches in particular. Let me skip through these slides. You can again see the slides that I send to you each week. They're in the emails that I send to you. I can make them available in the description underneath the video here as well. But you can review those, and I encourage you to do that. There's some slides that I keep there every week just as background information about 1 Peter that you continue to go back to. But we're following this as the design pattern for Peter, 1 Peter. This is the poster or the graphic that comes from the Bible Project video on 1 Peter, and we're following this as the author's intent and narrative design of the book itself. And we're working now through this middle section on the body of the letter that has to do with Peter's focus on suffering as a witness to Jesus. And it takes a variety of forms and often reflects the different status in life or the stations in life of people back then, but certainly does for us today as well. We are a diverse number of people from a variety of backgrounds and ages and educational experiences and job situations, even nationalities and countries of origin. And our following after Jesus is going to come to bear on us in different ways. Um, but in the light of the reality of the first century and how Peter addresses this here, there are significant ways we need to think and respond in very different circumstances today, but ones that are very much at odds with the natural order of things, or that put us in positions where we're going to face difficulty, and um, the measure of our faith and our commitment to our faith is going to become front and center and begin to affect relationships with others. And Peter uses this, he gives us an example here, yes, I should say, from the specific life stations or life situations of people in the first century that will help us to think through how we should properly respond today, just as he's exhorted us in the last couple of weeks. So we're moving into a section today that begins to look at the household, the Roman household in particular. And the first section has to do with slaves, and then moves into the marital relationship. And there are a lot of things going on here historically and culturally that I'll probably address more on Sunday, because we are getting together there, and so we can talk more specifically about how slavery was very different than the way we think about slavery in our world today, especially slavery has been in colonial America and beyond. There are very few comparisons in terms of how slavery was thought of in the ancient world, and the realities of it, and try to give you some background to that. But needless to say, it affected many people, and affected them in different ways. And so Peter wants to address that to those who have become followers of Jesus as well. Remember, we're working from a Hinge passage. There's a passage that's led us into this section of 2:11 to 4:11, and that's here in 2:11 to 12, where I've highlighted the idea of keeping away from worldly desires, being careful to live properly and honorable behavior. Think about those as general category terms, and now Peter turns to those who would find themselves in a position of being a slave or an indentured servant, sometimes by their own choices, oftentimes by choices that are not dependent upon them. But this general exhortation applies to that. What does it look like to keep away from worldly desires, to live properly, and to have honorable behavior if you find yourself in the position of a slave? So Peter's going to apply that to this today. Just bridging back from my last teaching on this, I said this at the conclusion of last week's teaching, that the broadest context for living proper lives is the context of the order within which all find themselves, believer and unbeliever alike, but in a way that is rooted in God's purposes for his world, and in such a way that will point them to the truth of who he is and what he is doing, made obvious through us as citizens serving as priests between him and the world whose benefit we seek. He speaks to the Roman system. He speaks to the governmental system, the larger, broader cultural and societal system that they were living in. And we live in a context like that today. So that's where he starts. And then he hones in on within that, looks at people in their various stages in life, particularly rooted in the household order of the time. First question that I ask is one that begins to stir up some thinking in you, and we'll talk more about these things, these questions on Sunday. As the bulk of our time, I want to spend more in discussion and interaction rather than me simply speaking, and but using that time for more interaction with us. But the first question that I pose is the assertion of personal and individual rights always the right thing to do? Is that always the highest ideal? Is that always the most wise and most appropriate thing to do? And that's underneath this passage, and one that will help bridge it into our context today. So just give that some thought. As we come together, and as you continue to follow along this teaching here. But let me just read through the whole passage in its entirety, just to get in our minds what Peter's saying here. He says this in 2:18 to 25. You who are slaves must submit to your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. For God is pleased when, conscious of his will, You patiently endure unjust treatment. Of course, you get no credit for being patient if you are beaten for doing wrong. But if you suffer for doing good and endure it patiently, God is pleased with you. For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you. He is your example, and you must follow in his steps. He never sinned, nor deceived anyone. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. By his wounds you are healed. Once you were like sheep who wandered away, but now you have turned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls. So there's God's word for us today in Peter's letter. So let's take a look at it here. How would you summarize this passage in your own words? What does it mean? What is Peter trying to communicate here? So one of the first steps that I ask you all to take is you read this and reflect upon it. What would you say he means to say in your own words here? What is he trying to communicate? That's one of the best first things that you can do is try to begin to understand in your own words and thinking through the passage what you believe Peter is trying to say, what he means to say. That's what we need to get at together. So we look at these verses and you see I've broken it up into sort of three parts here to take a look at each one. We have this first explanation of the situation. Here's the directive that's given to them. You see there in verse 18. Here, if you find yourself in this spot, again, the slave-master relationship was very different than the way we tend to think about it through colonial America and in the last 200 years. The ancient world is very, very different. You can become a slave for any number of reasons. Debt, losing a war. You could sometimes offer yourselves to someone to be their servant simply because they could provide for you and your family, and you had no other means of doing that. You honored that person, and or you attached yourself to that person and their household as a means of serving them. And slaves weren't just people who lived in rags or wore shabby clothes or anything. That slaves could be people in very, very different aspects of society, ones that we would think today would always be independent and self-responsible individuals. So this is the way things got done in the ancient world. And patronage is an idea that comes from it. The head of a household was a very, very strong individual, and he, each head of household was sort of a business into its own, in its own right, a corporation in its own right, with all sorts of moving parts to that and people involved and resources. So slavery fit into that context, and there was an order going on there, and so there questions are raised. Well, why wasn't Peter speaking against slavery? And I've heard scholars say, well, it'd be like me standing up on Sunday morning and telling all of you, don't use electricity anymore, don't use gasoline engines anymore. This is the way things get done. The whole world was organized around these things. And so Peter's concern is not to, again, for Christians to be so counter the order of things that it detracts from the message and the means of rescuing others into that. So how do you serve Christ within that order without drawing attention in a way that creates immediate opposition? That's somewhat of what's going on here. And so that's what I'm addressing with this question. We aren't slaves today, and the idea is pretty bad anyway. We just don't think slavery is a good thing. So what are we supposed to do with this? How is it relevant to us? We'll talk a little bit more about that on Sunday as well, but there's some other food for thought. And I've got a couple of quotes that help set the context for this a little bit, that again you can study and think about before Sunday. We can infer from the presence of slaves in the early Christian household codes that many slaves became Christians and that their behavior was potentially problematic. They had to be exhorted to obedience, both because they sensed a newfound freedom in the church. We talked about that last week, being free. And because it was important to the success of the gospel that they be orderly. That's an important idea. Such a concern in the early churches is, in my judgment, a clear reflection that the gospel created a new order of society. Whether or not the earliest churches were able to work this new order out in a consistent manner While they may not have done so in all its ramifications, as only time and situations can do, it remains true that the gospel itself created a people of God with a special identity, and this new condition led, because of the growth of the church, to social changes. And we saw that early on in the book where Peter was applying what had been true of Israel in the Old Testament is now true and new for all people who have faith in Christ. You're now you're a holy people. You're a royal priesthood. We talked about all of those things having a new special purpose and meaning in the world because of what God has done in Christ. And now this is the working out of those things in these various aspects of the order of the day back then. Another quote from one of the scholars we've been looking at: putting up with unjust suffering looks to us very much like colluding with wickedness. Wait a second, aren't I supposed to push back against evil? Many a violent household, many an abusive workplace has been able to continue acting wickedly because people have been afraid to speak out and have kept their heads down and put up with the abuse. Blowing the whistle on such behavior can cost you your job, your home, or even in extreme cases, your life. Peter here, has glimpsed the deeper truth behind the moral quagmire which is so obvious to us when we think of people putting up with unjust and painful treatment. He has reflected long and hard on the extraordinary events to do with Jesus. He has thought and prayed through them in light of the strange and dark scriptures which came to fulfillment in those messianic moments. And he invites followers of Jesus to inhabit this extraordinary story, to embrace it as their own, and being healed and rescued by those events, to make them the pattern of their lives as well. So, always asserting individual rights, always pushing back against unfair and unjust treatment is not always the right course of action. There may be a greater and a deeper purpose in things, but it has to be thought through carefully. We have to avoid both extremes where you just give in to anything, you never push back, or you always push back. There has to be wisdom. There are wise choices that have to be made, particularly in our order today, where we have a far more freedom and far more control and can take far more responsibility. We don't enslave ourselves to employers. However, we enter into a voluntary enslavement in the sense of obligating ourselves and them to us. When is it appropriate to break that? What are some of the rules that govern that when we do? There are things that this passage has to say about that, and we can and should think about them together, and we will on Sunday as well. So some of the core ideas in this first set of verses, that Peter starts with those who are low on the totem pole, and that's typically how these household texts works. They start with the people who are under submission or need to order their lives under someone else, and gives instruction to them. They seem to be very, very important in the whole scheme of things. And it's likely there was a great number of these type of people within the churches that his letter addresses. And likely all of us have faced unfair and unjust situations or find ourselves in difficult situations. So it's something that's very, very common. One's present state is to be directed and ordered by the intent that God has to shame the world through honorable living in that state. Always pushing back on the general of the order of things can be counterproductive. God may be wanting to do something far greater than our own comfort or our own safety, or our own justice or our own fair treatment. So we have to think about those things. That's a hard thing to say. It's a hard thing to think about, especially in our culture, which is so focused on the rights and the privileges of the individual. But as Christians, we think about a higher order, and so we have to think carefully about it. Doesn't mean you always do this or you always do that, but each and every situation is worth thinking through the higher principle of what God is doing in all of this, and our trust and faith in Him, and particularly in the example of Jesus, which we'll see in a minute. This is all predicated on the truth conviction that every wrong will be made right by God in the end, and the Jesus follower lives now by virtue of that future reality for the rescue of others from their certain fate. It is to please God as Jesus did and be driven by love. So love, a strong sense of love, not primarily a sense of justice and fairness, but a sense of love needs to be the core idea here that those other things orbit around. Because in the end, we know that perfect justice and perfect fairness will only be achieved when God ultimately brings about the consummation of all things, and Jesus returns and everything is made new. So in the light of those realities, the Christian has an opportunity to do something greater than merely fixing those things. God is fixing the world, and the Christian is invited to be part of that. And sometimes that might require us to um, um, work within a situation that is difficult, that we may be able to get out of or we may not be able to get out of. We have to think carefully about each situation. He goes on in this second section to focus on the example of Christ. Here's the model. Here's the paradigm. Um, this is this is what it's all about. And it all goes back to Jesus. We are followers of Jesus. We love Jesus. In the end of things, we're part of a church family and we're part of all kinds of things, and we call ourselves Christians, but all of that has its beginning and end in Jesus himself. We're going into a season now where with all the Christmas traditions and other things, let's not forget the opportunity to just focus on Jesus. That's always what we should do. That's not something we do at one time of the year, one season of the year. But in the end, everything turns and revolves around Jesus, and we lose that so often. So often we forget that that's really what it's all about. What He's done for us, what He's called us to do in following Him, and what He will ultimately do. It all begins and ends with Jesus, and those are the things that really, really matter. Um, what would you say we are called to do in the world as Jesus' followers? What's ultimately God's will for us and desire for us? And what will that cost us, and why is it worth it? Again, this experience is different from very, very, very different for Christians around the world, and expresses itself in different ways in both non-Christian or you know different kinds of societies, I should say. One of the comments on this general section is this, that here's an early Christian interpretation of Christ's life that is at the same time an exercise in the explanation of the essence of the Christian life. This little section, in other words, is a glimpse into a Christian worldview of the first century, a world not at all like our world because of the predominance of suffering in the early church. They were brand new on the scene and nobody understood what they were doing, and most everybody was against them, but a worldview that still retains its significance for Christian living. There may not be as much opposition now as there was for them then, but there is still opposition. There are still things and still people and situations that are at odds with our following after Christ, and so it has application to us. Just think about Peter himself. This is the same Peter who's writing that we see in Mark's gospel, and Mark was a disciple of Peter, so we know that this came firsthand from Peter himself, communicated through Mark, where Jesus is now making the turn and moving towards his ultimate goal of going to Jerusalem and being crucified. And he tells the disciples that, and here we see Peter's response. Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter, the one writing this letter that we're studying, took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, then reprimanded Peter, "Get away from me, Satan. Get away from me, you accuser." He said, "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." And you can see how that applies directly. Peter's learned this lesson, and he's now turned around after learning these things, and only after the crucifixion, resurrection, and the return, the disappearance of Jesus into to his throne room where he's running things. That now Peter is saying to these people, I see this differently now, not like then. I see it from God's perspective, and suffering can have a purpose, and the difficulties in your stations in life can have a purpose, just like it did for Jesus. I didn't understand it then, I understand it now, and I'm communicating that to you. So our faith and commitment to Jesus is shaped by his life and work as an extension of it in every generation. It was not just a one time with Jesus. We can't replace and repeat what Jesus did, but we can act in a manner consistent with it, generation in and generation out. This means that comfort, safety, and freedom from trouble is not the highest ideal and goal for our lives. Sometimes I wonder if Christians in our society, in our culture today, which worships those ideals as the highest, of individual privileges and responsibilities and rights, um, we understand that those things may not be necessarily consistent with what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Once again, our focus has to remain on Jesus together, not on traditions, expectations, or understandings that may be more cultural and personal in expression. We're all part of a larger plan and a larger purpose that, again, Peter has talked about those things in our study to this point and is now unpacking them in the lives of particular individuals and their stations in life. He quotes many Old Testament passages, particularly ones from Isaiah 53 here that you'd be familiar with if you know that passage. You could go back and look at it. A key point, the servant, the suffering servant in the prophet Isaiah, who's going to bring about the renewal of all things, who's going to go where God's people have gone and take upon himself their judgment and their punishment in order to save them as well as carry God's purposes out for the renewal of the world. That being written in a time of great crisis for the nation, Isaiah's time. Peter pulls that in here and applies them to Jesus, understanding clearly that he was the one being referred to there. He says he never sinned nor deceived anyone, speaking of Jesus. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. By his wounds you are healed. Once you were like sheep who wandered away, but now you have turned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls. So what is it about Jesus that we must keep before us? What can we do to retain this focus? And is it realistic? Are these just platitudes? Are these just things we say as Christians? Or do we really, or that we read in the scriptures? Or is there a reality to it that we really, really need to pursue in a daily way and keep it as a life focus? What happens when our focus moves away from Jesus, or Jesus has never been there in the first place? What does it mean to be, is there a difference between Jesus being in me and me being in Jesus? Which one of those really needs to be our focus, and that we needs to be part of our daily lives? But the way of suffering is the divinely intended manner of bringing the greatest victory of God into the world. That's what we see in Jesus and his cross and his resurrection. What really works is what works with God, and what works with God is the cross. The cross is a sterling example that, while we may be considered fools and conquered in this world's eyes, we are considered victors with God. We may be considered poor under society, but with God we are considered rich. And that's where it really, really matters. And that's where the understanding and the deep belief and conviction of who Jesus is and what he did makes all the difference for us when the world says otherwise. Other author says this: he, being Peter again, isn't simply recommending that people remain passive while suffering violence. So it's not just letting people do things to you. He is urging them to realize that somehow, strangely, the sufferings of the Messiah are not only the means by which we ourselves are rescued from our own sin, they are the means, when extended through the life of his people, by which the world itself may be brought to a new place. There's the mission. There's the bigger purpose. Peter believes that the death and resurrection of Jesus was and is the point around which everything else in the world revolves. Do we believe that? The death and resurrection of Jesus is the point around which everything else in the world involves. That's to have Jesus central to your life and your faith. Somehow, he is saying we must see all the unjust suffering of God's people as caught up within the suffering of his Son. You can see how those things go together. So some of the core ideas here in this third section. Your biggest problem and mine continues to be the danger of consuming love of self. That's our biggest problem. We love ourselves and our own comfort, safety, and security more than anything else. And that's what needs to be replaced with a love for Jesus and his example and model. That's what he means to take up his cross and follow him and to deny self. That's central to the Christian message. It's a natural and faithless tendency, but it has to be overcome if good works are to truly flow from us, especially amid opposition. It's much easier to retreat and to protect and preserve. So there's much to be reflected on here. We must keep nothing for ourselves or think that we can grasp ultimate justice or fairness. That's just not our task and shouldn't be our ultimate aim in life. That's God's place, and our hope can be there, or if it's not, it can result in ultimate despair when evil seems to have the upper hand. And there are going to be times, maybe many times, where it looks like God has abandoned us or God is not going to act on our behalf, and he may not in this life. And that's been true for believers since the time of the early church. That's why our ultimate, like Jesus, our ultimate belief and faith is that God is going to put everything right. And we may not experience that right away, but we know we will. It grows out of our faith, seeing what he did for Jesus, knowing he will do that for us because of Jesus is very, very important to grasp. We need healing and protection that is exclusive to Jesus, who alone is able to rescue our total selves, the guardian and shepherd of our souls, your soul being the totality of your person, who you are, body, soul, spirit, mind, all the physical and non-physical aspects of you. Jesus is the one who guards and protects us. And we were without a leader, we were without care. Now because of him, we are looked after, and we will be taken to, like Psalm 23 says, a place of good pasture forever, and dwell in his presence forever, and along with others too. Sheep always go in numbers. They never go alone, but they do need a shepherd. So as I've asked each week, I'd ask you to reflect on what problems or issues in our lives, ministry, culture today are being addressed by Peter here. What are the things out there in your world, your life, in our world, our lives, that these are addressing? Let's plan to give some specific attention to those when we meet together on Sunday. So my summary thought for this one, something like this. There are aspects of holy living in our position or station in life which will not always result in an improvement of our situation, but we can still serve a larger purpose as we stand alongside God's family and mirror the Jesus we follow. We can choose to first focus our energy on defending ourselves, or choose to trust God and wisely and prayerfully face difficulty that may reap far greater rewards beyond our own lives. Summary quote here. As one looks through this next section, and this is going to set the premise for the next couple of sections that we'll look at in the weeks to come. Through 1 Peter 2:11 to 3:12, one gains the impression that the orderly behavior the apostle enjoins on his churches is an orderly behavior anchored in the cross of Christ. It is not just a piece of pragmatic advice. Live orderly and you will not cause troubles for the church. Nor is it a piece of power. Live orderly or God will punish you. Rather, it's neither of those things. Rather, it is a piece of Christian theology, how to live wisely according to what God is doing. Live orderly because that is how Jesus himself lived, and that is the kind of behavior God wills. Such a theological basis gives rise to its benefits, for in this way of living we will be able to further the gospel the most. And that's why Jesus came, and that's what God has called us to further the good news of what it means that God is now King in Jesus, and he's calling all men, women, children, regardless of their station in life, to follow him. And then when you do, that may have implications for the station in life in which you find yourself, but it's worth it because you can now serve God's higher purposes in whatever situation you find yourselves. And we'll see more specifics to that, particularly as we look at marriages in the week to come. So again, that's hopefully going to prepare you for our time together on Sunday. We'll be all together at 10 a.m. in the auditorium, and those of you who are on Zoom at noon normally will join us at 10 a.m. And a link for that will go out in the emails in the next couple of days as well, so be on the lookout for those. Have a great Friday, and keep each other in prayer as we head towards the weekend. And hope you're enjoying these days leading up to a very different Christmas this year, but one perhaps more special than ever, with family and all the benefits that God has given us. So appreciate you all, and look forward to seeing you on Sunday.